what's been on my mind is that there are certain words that, if used, sort of place you outside the mainstream political discourse. Uh, Empire is one of those words. Late stage capitalism, or perhaps just capitalism. There are certain words that are taboo in the discourse, but that as a result, I think, of putting blinders on our thinking. And you recently gave a talk on reform versus revolution. And that's a topic I'd like to explore a little more, because revolution is another one of those terms that, if you say, well, I want to really see some revolutionary change here, people say, well, you're not serious, right? Because even though human history has been changed dramatically multiple times by revolutions, revolutionary thoughts, revolutionary movements, we've reached a point in history where we've come to believe that such a thing is mythical, fantastical, impossible. And I'm curious to know, your talk was more or less on the difference between reform and revolution. I won't ask you to repeat it, but what inspired you to give that talk?
Well, what inspired me, several things, as usual. One of them is that, and I'm personally very happy about this, that these questions about reform and revolution as strategic ways of thinking about what you want to do if you're at all activistically inclined, they're much more common than they were 5, 10, or 20 years ago. And I think that's healthy. I think that's very smart. I think it reflects the times we live in. I expect it to become more so. So that's one reason to go back and think again about a topic like that. Number two, I'm reacting against what you said. I'm reacting against that it's somehow a bad word that I shouldn't say, or I shouldn't think, or I shouldn't use. And that gets me upset, and I want to use it all the more because of that, just. Uh, and then finally, there are conversations that I see in the left wing half of this country that are, in fact, bringing that issue up. That is the issue of a reform versus a revolution. People are so provoked, understandably, by Mr. Trump's second presidency here. We're only a few months into it, clearly, and yet he has certainly moved quickly and boldly in a number of areas that have frightened people of all kinds about the international implications, about the security implications, about the internal freedom or not implications, that people are thinking about change. They're not happy. I'm talking about the left half. The
Right.
other half, that's a different matter. But the left half, and so the conversations are beginning, which even when they don't use the words, are in fact conversations about reformist responses and revolutionary responses. It's one thing to say that what we ought to do is elect other people in the midterm elections coming up
Right.
next November, and that's a reform. And there are other people who think, wow, that given what the Democrats have shown themselves able to do in the last few months, why in the world would you put confidence in that? Or to say this, put it another way, we're all observing, or I believe they're over now, but the national tour of Bernie Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez denouncing billionaires and so forth. And what does that mean? Is that a reform demand? Is that a revolutionary undertaking? Where does that fit? And people are discussing whether that is or isn't effective. And that raises all the issues of the reform versus revolution. And the last reason I do it is because I am very opposed to presenting these as options. In other words, to dealing with these as though we were, I'm exaggerating now, but just to make the point, as though we were looking at uh, two alternatives on the menu, and we're going to choose the one that tastes better, the one that and then we use words like one is more realistic or one is more practical. Then I get really upset because that's make for me. That's all make believe, and I would like to make that case.
Okay, well that's a great and very thorough answer. I just have a couple initial thoughts in response. One is very clear. I understand everything you've said, but I would add to it the timeliness of the topic of why I wanted to continue it with you is that, in fact, in their own way, Trump and the MAGA movement are revolutionary.
Yes, good point. Good point.
So the massive transformation, and of course they're funded and to a large extent guided by the Elon Musk and the tech elites who are profoundly transformative in a horrific way about the very nature of humanity itself. So, and they think, megalomaniacally in terms of, millions of years and trillions of humans and in future lives and how that justifies any atrocity they may care to make today. But they certainly ain't afraid of thinking small. And then you have the Christian right and the Koch brothers right. That's the Koch brothers went from printing what were considered lunatic pamphlets at Berkeley in 1970 to basically guiding the political discourse in this country and the governments of this country, Democratic and Republican. So I think that adds to the timeliness of the conversation. But I wanted to expand a little bit on let me stop before we get into the binary. What you're saying is a false binary. People, what do we mean by revolution? Because I think some people assume it means chaos. I think some people assume it means a violent revolt by one group against another group in power. What do you mean when you say revolution?
All right. Well, first, let me thank you for doing that. That's extremely important. I've learned in my long lifetime as a teacher that the most important terms in our language are differently understood as we speak about them. And if we don't make that explicit, all we do is foster one confusion after another. So, yes, you're absolutely right. The definitions are all over the lot. And for example, just to give you the beginnings of an answer, I don't think the word revolution has any necessary connection to the word violence. Uh, that's an open question whether a revolution will or will not entail violence, more or less of it. Uh, so for me, most of the time that I see those words linked, it's by people who are so frightened of revolution that they need to associate it with violence so that their opposition of violence can nicely extend over and become an opposition or the grounds for an opposition to revolution, whatever else it might mean. Um, you know, one last point on that. I don't think that what Israel is doing in Gaza is appropriately asked about or interrogated around the notion of a revolution. I don't think either side in the struggle inside Israel, nor either side between Israelis and Gazans, is particularly one about the revolution, either of Israeli society or of Palestinian society. I wish it were, but it isn't. And it seems clear to me that it isn't. So, anyway, what do I mean more positively rather than negatively? I mean a basic change in the socio-economic structure of a society. And there again, I understand those words also have multiple definitions. That is always true. Every definition is exactly what the word means. You're using other words to explain a word, and each of those other words is itself needing explanation, and that's a reductio that has no end. That
Right,
never
sure.
stops. So, for example, uh, and to get right to the point, when we had slavery in the United States, there were lots of people who, North and South, who found it an odious institution. I forget the famous American historian, the whatever it was. It was an evil institution, odious, and they hated it, and they became activists to do things like the following: improve the diet that was given to slaves by their masters, uh, reduce the punishment or the physical punishment that was meted out by masters to slaves, to pass laws or rules that would prohibit or limit the selling of slaves such that the families were separated, that the
Right.
children were sold to somebody other than the mother or the father, all of that. Uh, these are, for me, reforms.
Hmm?
These are reforms because there is an alternative approach to this issue, which says abolish slavery. That I would call a revolutionary demand. You are demanding a basic change because you feel that the other changes are inadequate to solve the problem. It does not mean you're against reform. And as revolutionaries have countless times argued, and in endless books and articles and manifestos, they are not against reform. They are in favor of reform, but they want to go in a very crucial sense further. Uh, Reformists, stung, I believe, by the criticism of revolutionaries, have tried to react by painting the revolutionary as not only not taking the reforms further, but threatening to deny the reform. In other words, provoking
Right.
a reaction which will prevent. And so we listen to arguments. I find them intolerable. Listen to arguments that the revolutionary is a romantic, or the revolutionary is unrealistic, or the on and on and on. Um, but when John Brown or people like that said, we're not here to get a better diet for the slave, that's not the problem. The problem, that they said, is slavery. We want to abolish this basic social institution in which some human beings can relate to other human beings in a property relationship. We find that, whatever it is, horrible, unbearable, and so on. So for me, for example, just to use the analogy and to be provocative, fighting for a higher minimum wage, which I have done all my life, is a reform. I am pushing for a reform. It's really like getting a better diet for the slave. It's getting a higher wage for the employee so that she can, stop living on Hostess Twinkies and all the rest of that sort of thing. Uh, but that's not a revolution, not by any stretch of the imagination. The Democratic Party allows itself, less and less, but it still does to a limited degree, to advocate for reforms. But I don't think there's any revolutionary anything in the Democratic Party. And I think there's a hostility. The way they treated Bernie is is an example of reformists who want to expunge the revolutionary alternative, who do not will are not willing to coexist with it, not willing to debate and struggle with it, not at all. They can be forced to do it, but they're not doing it if they're not forced to do it, and they would rather eliminate those folks. They did nothing to return the a further left. The Bernie and Ocasio-Cortez are constantly in an adversarial situation relative to the middle, the centrists, and so on.
And I would argue, I have a lot of respect for what they're doing. And as you know, I worked for Bernie on his first campaign, but I would argue they're closer to reformers than revolutionaries.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the fact that they faced this hostility, Richard Wolff, there's been an interesting development within the Democratic Party. I've written about it a lot, but uh, over the last maybe 50 years, if you think back to when the terms left and right were first developed, and there was the left side of the French legislature that I guess you could say was pretty much egalitarian in various
Right.
forms. It had that sort of set of principles. The right side was more oriented towards aristocracy and wealth, and then the rest. It seems to me I'm obviously grossly oversimplifying, but the rest was a matter of tactics and strategy and how to advance their various ideals. But what we've seen in the Democratic Party in particular, it seems to me, is that reform, or what I write about as incrementalism, has become an ideology of its own,
Right.
or a belief, a value system of its own. I remember I was debating, I won't name him, but one of the absolute top Democratic Party economists in the country, held very senior positions on Medicare for all, and modestly think I was doing pretty well. And his fallback was that's neither here nor there, but his fallback was finally, well, I have to admit it, I'm an incrementalist. And I thought, but incrementalism is a strategy, it's a tactic, it's not an ideology. It's, you know, right? I mean, democratic economics is an ideology, and free market economics is an ideology, and social justice is. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
And that's what I think part of what we're up against is the sort of making sacred, the sacralization of reform, not only as more real than revolution, but the ideological enemy of revolution.
Yeah. I saw that also some years ago. There was I guess it was 1989, a 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. And in France, in Paris, um, if you were there at the time, and I was close to that there, uh, you couldn't help but notice the extraordinary degree to which the government at that time, which was conservative, downplayed the revolution. I mean, they had to celebrate it. You know, so they'd had 100th anniversary. I mean, it is the founding of the republic that is France. So that it's like the 4th of July. You have to have it, but you can be damn careful to expunge from it anything. You know, the 4th of July is now an occasion for a picnic. It has nothing, no one virtually remembers that this country also was founded by something that the people involved felt was a revolution. And it was called that, it's still called that, the American Revolution. And yet here was a government, and with the exception of the far left political parties, which France has, they celebrated the revolution, although very symbolically, very little concrete. They didn't do what we're trying to do here. They didn't try to say, "Hey, this is what we mean when we celebrate the 200th anniversary of of the French Revolution. For me, if it's not inappropriate to go to that dichotomy you spoke of earlier, I look at history this way. When systems totter, like in the Great Depression, right? Global capitalism really took a hit, like it did after the 2008 and 9 and so forth. And like I believe we're going through now, but whether you agree with that or not, everyone kind of agrees that the Great Depression was a global, worldwide collapse of the capitalist system, producing absurd amounts of decline of economic production, vast unemployment, all the rest of it. Okay, in those moments, the issue of reform versus revolution becomes real and concrete and very realistic. So you had people um, in the New Deal coalition here in the United States. There were people who were very clear they were reformers. They wanted to. They thought the exciting thing would be to pass a law that says that a commercial bank cannot engage in investment activity and an investment bank cannot take deposits and so forth and so on. And this was an important way to reform the system, and they did that. And we had unemployment insurance, which we'd never had before. That was a reform. And we had a minimum wage passed, and that was a reform, and so forth and so on. But there were all at that time socialists, communists, and people in the labor movement who said, much as my example of slavery before, that's not the problem. The problem is capitalism, right? And Roosevelt, the way I read it, Roosevelt listened to this debate and said, it's clear to me which I want. I don't want anything to do with revolution. And you're asking me to help you with New Deal legislation. I'll do it, but you've got to vote for me and you got to shut up about revolution because I'm going to take this back to my social class, the ruling class, and I'm going to say, give me the money to do for the mass of people what they're demanding because the government had no money. Unemployment and collapse, there was no money. The government couldn't do anything. The only people who had money were the rich. And he would go to the rich and he would say to them, give me the money to take care of the masses. And the reason you should do that is because if you don't, there will be a revolution and you won't have any money to give anybody. So this is a good deal. You get to keep half. The other half you're going to give me in taxes and loans. And I'm going to use it to have Social Security, unemployment compensation, and all of that. Hire 15 million people. I'm going to do all of that. And that will prevent a revolution, which is what you're paying me to do. And I will do that. Okay, so a deal is struck between Franklin Roosevelt and the reformist, and that pushed the revolution off the social agenda, leaving the Communist Party and the others out there advocating for something that everybody to their left, 4/5 of the country at least, had no interest in. And they failed. Not so surprising. But here's the punchline. In the 70 years or 75 years, whatever it is, since the end of the New Deal, the capitalist class in this country has devoted itself to undoing the New Deal. And Mr. Trump is the capstone of that project. And the Democrats, at first, were culpable of not stopping it. Then it got worse. They actually did it too. They became complicit. They didn't advance the needs of the working class. They became complicit in undoing the very New Deal, culminating with Clinton and his welfare reform and all of that other junk. So here's my conclusion, which I want to be as provocative to people as possible. You ought not to think of reform and revolution as either ors, as menu items to choose. I understand that that happened. I gave one example of the New Deal. But the conclusion we ought to draw is that you need a revolution because without one, anything achieved in the way of reform is temporary, insecure, vulnerable, and as the last 75 years shows, amenable to being undone because you haven't changed the system at a profound enough level to prevent that from happening.
If I were to choose one word to describe what, for lack of a better term, re-radicalized me in life, it's that word temporary. It's the fact that every advancement under the current system has proven to be, I mean, 50 years, decent like the time. Maybe actually the New Deal didn't last that long. It certainly wasn't comprehensive, didn't include everyone, but it was a good set of, a strong set of reforms that I've come to believe couldn't last. Just as we had reforms in the 1970s, at least in on paper, in America's position on global human rights, which has dramatically been undone
Yeah.
by the sort of anti-democratic economic forces that rule us. And so, and this fear of violence has kept us from thinking more broadly, even though France almost had a revolution in 1968 without an armed uprising. Howard Zinn, the great historian, points out that while Americans believed it was necessary to have a revolutionary war to get their independence from Great Britain, Canada didn't have to fight a war, and yet they got their own form of revolution. Civil, freeing of the slaves. Americans believed we needed a civil war to do that. Well, Great Britain and other countries freed slaves without fighting a civil war. So it's a two-sided. We think revolution means violence, and we think violence is the only way to make major change. But I guess I wanted to conclude by saying, although this runs the risk of sounding banal, it really has to become a revolution in thinking, doesn't it? Because, for example, all those people who deplored slavery could look back and say, well, but it's been a part of human history. There's now fossil records saying there were enslaved people 11,000 years ago. Capitalism is only 300 years old, but it was considered unthinkable to do anything but reform slavery. It took, except of course for enslaved people, but it took a change in an almost Copernican shift in the way people were able to think about it. Now we're asking them to do that again, I think, aren't we? We're asking them to say the real revolution begins with understanding that and again, I'm sorry if it sounds at all trite, but in understanding that the way things are by no means the way they have to be.
Yeah, I think what's happening, though, maybe you and I disagree a little. I mean, we make a joke. I know you've made the joke too. I think you did. That the best recruiter for the left right now is Donald Trump.
Right.
And I think the lesson I draw from that is something has to happen to a population that becomes habituated to a particular social system and to a politics that divides between those who are perfectly happy with that social system and simply want to perpetuate it versus those who say, wow, we could do better than this, and I'm push for some amelioration, some modification, some improvement, and that's it. But then a point is reached in society when that won't satisfy people. There's too much dysfunction. There's too much contradiction given whatever they've been thinking to handle it anymore in that frame. And I think Trump represents, this time from the right, a feeling that the country is really dissolving. He wants to make America great again. He wants to almost in a revolutionary way, get down deep into the structure of the society and radically alter it. And he identifies, the development of a kind of equality rhetoric around DEI or non-white people, non-male people, non-Christian people, that they have a place here, has accumulated to the point where he mobilizes large parts of the people who want to undo all of that, who really are white supremacists. And
But
it's
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I,
please.
I would argue that while there's a lot of truth to that, that the reformists created fertile ground for that. I mean,
Absolutely.
there have always been white supremacists, for example, awful human beings, deplorable to use Hillary's word. But we also have a situation where I think the reformists used the classic left, socialist, communist left concepts of social equality, social justice, civil rights to and weaponize them against the fight for economic justice and economic equality in such a way that you could have the CEOs of all the major banks, quote unquote, taking the knee in photographs during the second Black Lives Matter uprising, and with this symbolic gesture towards equality, continuing their racist policies in terms of issuance of loans, their sexist policies, and so on. So what happened then, I think, was you had mostly white, but a certain element of black and brown working people to say, hey, I don't feel included in this so-called fight for justice. In fact, it feels to me like when you use this language that I barely understand, and I'm not saying that in a condescending way, by the way, that you don't care about me. So this guy Trump, he's rough around the edges, but he knows that's BS, and he's talking about making my life better because I can't make ends meet. And I think, I'm not defending the white supremacists. I abhor them, but I think there are a lot of people who went for that, and in that sense, I blame the reformists. Not as much as Trump, but I think they hold some responsibility for this.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I know I'm going to be writing about in the months ahead is I'm beginning to see the Democratic Party, or that part of the politics, you know, developing a line about Trump that he's aberrational, he's abnormal, he's a right wing weird, as a way to absolve themselves of all
Right.
responsibility. They produced this person. And the way I would argue it, and I feel this out of my personal life, after 1945, the liberals of this country participated in the purging of the left. They made it impossible for the far left to have a place, to have a voice, to have a chance to make its arguments. Meanwhile, the far right was permitted. The far right was seeing, oh, yes, you overstate the case, but they were fellow anti communists. And so they had a place. So now, when the system falls apart, what do the mass of people have? They have a long, historically developed far right because it was able to function. It could raise the money, it therefore had the outlets, it could build its community. Whereas the left was blocked from doing that overwhelmingly. And so now the right is strong to step into the breach, to say to people, the country's falling apart, you better go with us. And they have an audience. We have to start from scratch and rebuild the audience we once had. And for that reason, the liberals, without whom the purging of the left could not have succeeded, they bear their share of responsibility for everything that Trump represents. And I think it is extremely important for the left in America to say that. to find ways of getting that message out there.
And to not become infected as the true left with this contempt for working people who don't already agree with you.
Yes, right.
Which goes to me goes along with it. To be
Yes,
willing to make your case anywhere, anytime. I used to say, shoot me up in a rocket and drop me anywhere on the surface of the United States. I'll walk to the nearest house and sell them on Medicare for all if they'll give me an audience, just by going over the family budget with them. So
you know who taught me that same lesson? This may embarrass you. Be careful. Here we go. It was Lenin. I remember as a young person reading, I don't know how it came into my hands. Some student or teacher gave it to me, a speech late in his life, a year or two before he died. So the Soviet Revolution had happened, and he was the big leader. But he was invited to give a talk to some Russian organization, and he said, I had a prepared talk. I'll never forget it. I'm not going to give you the prepared talk because you have all been asking me the same question. What is to be done?
right.
I remember he wrote that famous
Sure.
pamphlet, and that comes from that great novelist who I also read with great interest, Chernyshevsky, the Russian novelist of the 19th century. Anyway, he said, here's what we have to do. We have to talk to everybody. And then he said, wait a minute, that's wrong. You, he said, have to talk to everybody. There is don't worry about what is the right group to talk to, what is the right thing to say. Don't worry. The important thing is that the largest possible number of us are out there talking this way, that way to everyone. And then he goes through, the people who are religious, the people who hate us, the people who it doesn't matter. It was like an instruction manual for what you just said.
Well, that's interesting. I was more of a follower of John Lennon in my youth, but
Well, maybe they're related.
they could be. Who knows? At any rate, we'll have to end it there. But as always, Richard Wolff, thanks so much for a stimulating and fascinating conversation. Thanks for coming on the program.
Glad to be back and glad to be in conversation with you.
As am I. We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.